Okay, here's my audience. Are you in the frame?
Yes, I'm in the
Are you in
frame.
the frame? All right, cool. All right. As consumers become more aware of the prevalence of genetically modified organisms, GMOs in food and the fight for mandatory labeling is now a big concern among Americans today. With genetically modified food, sciences and corporations work to make food more efficiently and cheaply for Americans looking to buy food cheaper. And so, genetically modified foods need to be labeled because consumers want to know what they want to eat and what they are drinking at the same time, and what's inside all of their food being modified. Researchers have examined the necessity of labeling genetically engineered foods when already tested and passed in the laboratory for safety and toxicology. Consumers demand to know what they are eating, and that is the one confrontation that leaves production companies behind, even though they argue it could be more costly and even up to 10% more cost concerning to the consumer. The use of genetically engineered foods over the past couple of decades has helped corporations grow food more efficiently and at a higher rate for less money and higher quantity. The benefits of genetically modified foods ranges from many things from cheaper food, better quantity, better quality, and you can get it anywhere in the world faster. But the concern for those scientifically enhanced foods is that with that also comes a need for labeling because consumers want to know what's inside their food, what exactly they're eating, and what processes have been taken to make sure that their food is safe. Alternatives have been found for those who fight for the anti-labeling, claiming that consumers can simply buy organic foods, meaning that they're completely natural, there's no preservatives, no artificial ingredients inside of them, and that way they don't need to be worried about the presence of genetically modified organisms in certain samples of food. The development, as consumers are becoming more aware of these genetically modified foods, the pressures for mandatory labeling continues to grow for inorganic food producing companies. The development of genetically modified organisms in foods present positive effects, but has been weakened by efforts of mandatory labeling and the negative connotation presented by scientifically enhanced food. Although health issues help drive consumer opinion and motivation, corporations feel that the high cost of labeling, getting rights, getting licensing, and the cost of printing the labels and getting them on the food themselves will drive consumers to steer away from the fact that mandatory labeling is necessary, when in turn it ends up not being necessary because it could cost them up to 10% of what it originally cost them without being labeled. Businesses argue alternatives such as organic foods, like I just said, but ultimately feel as if mandatory labeling for these GMOs would be a waste of money and energy for the parties involved. However, many consumers still argue that the need for labeling is necessary because though the expression of genes within modified food says that they're different, structurally they are still changing, and from a science background they want to know how they're changing and how it's going to affect their health in the long run. And so consumers have rights to know what's inside of their food at all times and how science changed their foods and how artificially enhanced foods and how they should be noted. And let's see, with the generic recombination comes the want for recognition in the food, in the form of mandatory labeling. Although the majority of people in the United States have lobbied for labeling of these foods, the necessity is still in debate. With the adoption of labeling comes more money that needs to be spent by not only the corporation but also the consumer, when many argue if cost is even worth it. For example, with all of the transportation, processing, and storing of this food, how will corporations successfully be able to separate the GMOs from non-genetically engineered food? How would consumers be willing to pay when the FDA has already taken efforts to identify that these foods are safe and healthy for consumption through toxicology and laboratory experiments? And will people still fight for mandatory labeling of GMOs if they know about the long-term health effects and how minimal they are? Overall, the mandatory labeling efforts in the United States goes unseen due to the insignificance and not being necessary. With regulations put in place previously by the FDA, those in favor of case-by-case labeling could be waiting for that idea for a long time to come, especially because of the economic impact that mandatory labeling would have. However, if more questions are being asked about what's inside the food and what the consumers want to know is what's being served to them is what they want to know, then more questions need to be answered regarding the benefits of labeling food. on a stringent or a stringent system needs to be put into place for labeling in the United States. In other countries like Europe and China and places like that, mandatory labeling is necessary because of the way that they enhance the food, and many Americans see that when they travel there and feel like that'd be a good thing for the United States. However, here with science experiments done, with laboratory precautions put in place, it just feels that, the fight might not be necessary. Americans could see labeling of all genetically modified organisms or food that contain them if the push is still being persistent and still being driven by consumers daily. But for now, most Americans see it as unnecessary due to the fact that these foods are usually safe. It goes unseen and hardly even noticed that these foods are being genetically enhanced. So, with that being said, genetically modified foods are good for corporations because of the fact that they can produce food cheaper at a higher quantity and a good quality and get it to their consumers fast. But consumers still do want to know what's inside their food. And so that's the fight with mandatory labeling, and that's how labeling genetically modified foods will impact us and how we eat them and as America as a whole in the long term.